Hello, my Algebra 2 students. We have another day with amplitude, frequency, and period. So before we get started, I want you to start by graphing the sine and cosine graphs from 0 to 2 pi. I think it helps if you plot the unit circle and think about here's 1, 0, 0, 1, -1, 0, and then 0, -1. So sine is the y values. So we're going to start at 0, at pi over 2, go to 1. At pi, it comes to 0. 3 pi over 2 drops down to -1. And at 2 pi comes back to 0. And then cosine, you're plotting it for the x coordinates. So start at 1, come down to 0, keep going down to -1 at pi, bring it back to 0 right here, and then all the way back up to 1. So make sure and hit those exact 5 points and then connect the dots as best you can. So that's where you're starting. For the parent functions, because that's what these are, like the most basic sine and cosine, the amplitude and frequency are both 1, because there's a 1 here and a 1 here. The period is that you see one cycle from 0 to 2 pi. The phase shift is 0 because it's not shifted left or right. And the midline is y equals 0 because there's nothing added to the end. Okay? Everything from there can then change. But we're focusing on changing the amplitude, changing the frequency. So for this, you can answer the bottom part first and then graph, or vice versa. We're going to do a little bit of both. So what I mean by that, the number in front of sine, that's your a value. The number in front of the x, that's your b value. So right off the bat, the amplitude is the a value. That's going to be the 3. The frequency, that's the b value. That's your 2. So you don't even need a graph to answer that. All right, the period of the graph, that we are going to have to think about the frequency. So I want to see 2 full cycles between 0 and 2 pi. So if we're going to see 2 cycles from 0 to 2 pi, that means from here to here, I see 2 cycles. The first cycle is going to have to finish at this like halfway point right here at pi itself. The phase shift, there's nothing added in here. There won't be one. The midline, there's nothing added on the end. It should stay y equals 0. So that means the x-axis is going to cut right through the middle of that graph. All right. In terms of sine, think about what we just did a moment ago. It starts at 0, ends at 0, hits 0 dead center. Think about that here. I want it to start at 0. This one's going to end by pi, and then it hits 0 dead center. So that's at pi over 2 itself. Then from there, it goes up and then comes back down. So how high up it's going to go? It's going to hit that height of 3. So come all the way up to 3 at the halfway point. So it's actually halfway between those 2 tick marks. And then halfway between these 2 tick marks will come all the way down to 3, or excuse me, -3. So this will come all the way up and then come all the way back down. Now, if you look at the directions, it says sketch it from 0 to 2 pi. So we have to sketch a second cycle. So it's going to start at pi, end at 2 pi, hit dead center at 3 pi over 2, and then come on up and hit the top halfway between. It's always symmetrical. Hit the bottom halfway between these 2. So there's that second cycle right there. All right. For the second graph, let's pick out what we can just from the equation. So the amplitude, the frequency. Now, quick detail here, the amplitude, remember, it's never negative. So it's really the absolute value of that. And so it comes out to be 1/2, right? But that negative is going to be important. That means it's going to be reflected or have a reflection over the x-axis. So it's going to look upside down. The frequency, that's the 3 right here, which means we're going to see 3 cycles from 0 to 2 pi. So then the period of 1 cycle, you're going to have to take 2 pi and break it up into 3 parts, right? Whereas this one, we took 2 pi and we broke it into 2 parts. That's why the length came out to be just plain old pi by itself. All right. This is going to get a little tricky. That means we're going to have to be really careful with our x scaling, right? The phase shift, though, there isn't one. The midline should be right at y equals 0. Okay, so a couple of things. I want to take note of the fact that the amplitude is going to go up to a half and down to -1/2. So it's going to be trapped kind of between those two values. In terms of the x-axis, we want to see one cycle from 0 to 2 pi over 3, right? In regards of that, let's look at the whole number of tick marks from 0 to 2 pi. So from 0 to 2 pi, there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. If there's 12 tick marks and I need to see 3 cycles, the length of each little cycle is going to last 4 tick marks. So if I come out 1, 2, 3, 4, that right there has to be 2 pi over 3. All right, that's how I can actually kind of space this out correctly. Even if you weren't sure what to label it, the first cycle is going to fit from here to here. Now go 4 more tick marks. 1, 2, 3, 4. The second cycle will fit from there to there. The last cycle, 1, 2, 3, 4, will beautifully fit in between here. All right. So even if you're not sure how to label it, don't worry about that. Just evenly space it out. So 1, 2, 3 cycles. Okay. Now it's cosine. So think of the basic cosine graph that we sketched up above. It would typically start above the midline, come down, and then come back up. This one is flipped over, so it's going to start below the midline. We're going to start down at -1/2. It's going to finish at -1/2. It's going to hit the top at dead center. So go to the dead center of those 4 tick marks and come up top to +1/2. And then it's going to cross the axis halfway between those 2 points. So at that first tick mark here and at the second tick mark there. That is my first little cycle. And now you're going to repeat that. So do the same thing in this next section. So from here, finishes there, hits top here, crosses halfway between. There's my second cycle. Do it one more time. So start, finish, hits top in the middle, crosses the axis halfway between those. There's our third cycle. All right. So if you can slowly break it down, then it's a little bit easier to digest. All right, we have a little more to go on the back. Let's flip it on over. So here, we're asked to sketch the function y equals -2 sine of 4x on the grid for 1 full cycle. So you're not asked to graph from 0 to 2 pi like we were on the last one, just 1 full cycle. So because it's a sine graph, I always want you to keep in mind, all right, what does a basic old sine graph look like? It starts and finishes at 0, dead center at 0, goes up, comes down. That's the parent function. That's y equals just plain old sine of x. All right, what are the things that are going to change here? Well, the amplitude or the a value, that's going to be the absolute value of -2. So it's going to be stretched a bit. The fact that it's negative means that it's going to reflect over the x-axis. And then that 4 right here, that's the b value or the frequency. So if the frequency is 4, that means we're going to see 4 cycles from 0 to 2 pi. But we're only going to graph one of them. So that means the period, I'm going to take 2 pi. If I break it into 4 parts, this whole graph, this whole cycle is going to just exist from 0 to pi over 2. Right? So this is how I know how to scale my x-axis right there. Right? So given that this is a blank slate right here, go ahead and give yourself a y-axis. And then you can go right through the middle. Give yourself an x-axis or as close to the middle as you see fit. All right, I still want to have some space. So I know it's going to start at 0 and it's going to be done by pi over 2. So I'm going to space this out a little bit. So rather than making it like 2 tick marks, maybe I'll go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. It's always a good idea to pick an even number. All right, don't worry about labeling the rest. I went 8 tick marks, so I'm going to go halfway. So 1, 2, 3, 4, mark it, and then half of each of those. So 2 this way, 2 that way. So just have them evenly spaced out. All right, from here, think about what we're doing. We start at 0, it ends at 0, halfway it hits 0. This is going to stretch all the way up to 2 and down to -2. but because it's negative in front, it's going to go down first. So from here, I'm going to go down and hit -2 at that first tick mark. So that it'll then come back up. Halfway between these two, it's going to hit +2 at that second tick mark and come back down. All right. This little detail, when it says note, the sine curve starts its cycle on the blank, whereas the cosine curve starts the cycle above or below, it always starts right on the x-axis, or more specifically, on the midline. And so what I mean by that is where it started, we were on the midline, finished on the midline, dead center hits the midline, right? Cosine will start either above or below wherever the midline is. Okay, we're going to do one last example, and we'll save the rest for class. Determine an equation for the graphs that are given here. So I wish you guys could see. Teddy just hopped up on the window. He wants in. He's outside right now. So what I want you to do is highlight one cycle. So if I just take my red pen right here, and it starts here, always started at 0, all right? So this, since I start at 0, I'm going up, coming back down. That alone is telling me something about the graph. So remember this little hint we just said? Sine starts on the midline, whereas cosine would start off. So the fact that this is starting on the midline, that tells me that this is going to be a sine curve, all right? Because it starts on the x-axis / midline. All right, so here's the details that you're going to need. The fact that I know, oops, I'm a little crooked there, that this is a sine curve means you have to figure out what's the amplitude, sine of what's the frequency, x. We have not talked about phase shift or shifting the midline yet, so we're only solving for these two things. So now when you look at the graph, you have to be able to figure out what's the amplitude, what's the frequency. So when you look up here, it's stretching all the way up to 3 and down to -3. So my amplitude should be 3. That's going to come in front. And then in terms of the frequency, if it's graphed from 0 to 2 pi, then look at how many cycles. So here was one cycle. There's the second one. So if we're seeing 2 cycles from 0 to 2 pi, then the frequency is 2. If it's not as obvious as that, sometimes we have to work backwards from the period. But otherwise, in this case, we can pretty well see it. So we could plug in a 2 right there. And that is the equation. Now, if you wanted to check it, you can type this into your calculator. As always, make sure you're in radian mode, and then you can take a look at it. Otherwise, we'll save B and example 4 for class 4 tomorrow. See you guys then.